I know that Game Week 9 isn't even over yet, but that doesn't stop me making some content for you guys. In this video, I'm going to talk about players to buy and avoid for Game Week 10. Now, you're going to notice a theme about the first three players I'm going to talk about in this video. The first player, though, I wanted to mention is Cole Palmer. He seems to be absolutely nailed now in that Chelsea team. It's clear Poch regards him really highly. He's given him quite a lot of freedom to operate in that midfield. Currently sitting at 1.1% ownership at 4.9 million. I think if people are wildcarding for Game Week 10, he's a really nice option. He's now taken up the role as penalty taker. He's taken the penalties for Chelsea. Sterling, who could have been the penalty taker, bit of a chance he took the next one. He gave the ball to Palmer for the penalty he took against Arsenal. So I think there is no doubt that Palmer is now the Chelsea penalty taker. I think he's just in general playing with a bit of like a chip on his shoulder, you know, trying to prove that he deserves to be starting for a top team in the Premier League and potentially getting himself in the England team. I mean, the level of performance that he put in against Arsenal certainly justified being up for selection. I'd also say at 4.9 million, they've got some tough old fixtures coming up. But at that price, I mean, you can bench him, right? I mean, 4.9 million is perfectly fine for a player you could just sit on your bench. Potentially for that Man City, Spurs, Newcastle run, a couple of those games, he could well sit on your bench if you don't fancy him. One thing I will say, he's undoubtedly going to rise in price, in my opinion. There are going to be a lot of wildcarders in Game Week 10 and a lot of players eyeing him up. So Cole Palmer, the first player I wanted to talk about. You might have already been able to guess the theme of the first three players. Anthony Gordon is the guy I wanted to talk about next, sitting at 5.6 million. Looks to be the first choice left winger for Newcastle. I think there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, obviously, Harvey Barnes is injured. That reduces the competition that Gordon has for a spot in the starting 11. He also works really hard defensively. He's a really tenacious player, and we all know that managers like that kind of work rate and play style. So for me, I think Eddie Howe absolutely loves the guy. And he's putting up some really strong numbers. I mean, every time he plays, you pretty much just expect to see Gordon either on the assists or goals for everything that goes on for Newcastle at the moment. I really do think he's looking really, really good. 5.6 million, I mean, you can't go wrong at that price. Couple of tough fixtures mixed in there, but you know, Newcastle looking really decent going forward. So I wouldn't put it past him to be able to score against Arsenal, Chelsea and Man United. He's got 7 returns in 7 starts this season. I think he's only going to continue that kind of form. You'll probably see the theme with these players, but Gordon is definitely one to be buying. Pedro Neto, then, you probably guessed it already, is the next player I wanted to talk about. Another sub 6 million midfielder that seems to be ticking along really nicely. I've actually got him in my team myself. I picked him just over Cole Palmer because I don't think Cole Palmer, when I played my wildcard, was quite just a nailed option in that Chelsea team basically, but he certainly is now when Anthony Gordon had a suspension. So I was kind of led to go for Pedro Neto. To be honest, out of the three, it's really hard to choose between them, I've got to say. Pedro Neto, he's probably the most nailed of the three, I would say. He's probably Wolves' best player and probably the first name on the team sheet for like the attacking players at least. He's just ticking along really nicely. Watkins hasn't played in Game Week 9 at the time I'm recording this video, but Pedro Neto is joint with Ollie Watkins as the top assisters in the league this season. They've both got 7. Wolves have okay fixtures. I think of the 2 teams we've seen, probably have the best so far, with 3 teams including Palmer. I don't know, I mean, you can make that decision for yourself. I'd say though that Wolves are in decent form, and as they proved against Man City, they can bag some goals against the top teams. So yeah, I wouldn't be put off, you know, that Newcastle, Spurs and Arsenal set of fixtures, because Wolves could do alright in those games. And my general point amongst all the 3 players really is, if you pick one of them, it's just good for your team structure. You might want to move on. You know, you pick Pedro Neto, doesn't return, gets injured, etc, etc. You can easily hop on to Gordon or Cole Palmer. I think certainly if you're on your wild card, it's a really smart option to have a player in the midfield at this price point, because there are multiple options you can go to now. And just in general, a lot of players, as you probably saw when looking at the stats for Cole Palmer and Anthony Gordon, a lot of them are kind of overperforming their expected assist stats. Well, that's the general consensus that we're seeing. But Pedro Neto has one of the best expected assist stats in the league at the moment, which suggests he's one of the most creative players in the league so far. And that for me suggests that he's got the backing of not only the actual returns, but the underlying numbers to suggest that he's playing at a really high level and those returns should continue. Now, I'll put my hands up The next section of this video is going to be a bit Arsenal heavy, but I think with the fixture run they have coming up, bar the Newcastle away game, I think a lot of people, particularly wildcarders, are going to be targeting the Arsenal players, so it makes sense to start talking about them. Saka down to 8.5 million now, came back from his injury versus Chelsea and got an assist. Didn't really do much else in the game. To be honest, he didn't even look 100% fit, but he played and got the assist when it really mattered. He is still Arsenal's designated penalty taker, as we all know, despite, some of them getting given away. He is the designated penalty taker, so there is obviously a chance he could get a penalty in every game he plays. Just in general, though, he is Arsenal's best player and their talisman, right? Everything decent they do seems to go through him, and I'd say in comparison to Martinelli, who I might talk about next, he's nailed in his position, right? Arsenal don't really have any competition for Saka in that right wing position, and we've seen that really. He's been getting injured because Arteta's overplaying him, and to be honest, I don't think he was fully fit for the Chelsea game, and he still got played by Arteta because he's just so important to him. I think Sheffield United, another week to go until that fixture. He's got a good chance to rest up, recover. It's literally one of the worst teams in the league at the Emirates. I mean, it's an absolute plum fixture to get him for. The next player I wanted to mention quickly is one that I'm not totally sold on, but I think a lot of players are going to consider him, and that's Martinelli. 7.7 million, 4.6% ownership. So he's substantially cheaper than Saka and Odegaard as well, who I'm probably not going to mention in this video. Both at 8.5 million. Martinelli's 0.8 million cheaper. And of course, he's 4.6% owned. So he's a nice cheaper option with less ownership than the two of them. I'd still think he's Arteta's first choice left winger. Trossard came on against Chelsea and scored. However, I still think Martinelli is going to start against Sheffield United. And he's proven across the last couple of seasons, really, that he can score against anyone. The numbers that he's put up so far are not fantastic. I mean, 0.31 expected returns per 90 compared to Saka on 0.85. That's the kind of downside to him at the moment. The assists and goals basically have not quite been there yet this season, but he's got a proven track record of getting both in the Premier League. We all know how he ended up last season, one of the top scoring midfielders in the game. I don't see any reason why he couldn't continue that this season. And the final Arsenal player I wanted to talk about in terms of a buy perspective at least is Gabriel. He's the cheapest starting Arsenal defender at the moment. He looks to have nailed his spot again. The only kind of risk you'd have is Arteta has been known to play a slightly different system when playing the lower level opposition, who he probably expects to play a low block. We see Partey coming in at right back, Ben White moving to centre back, and Gabriel being pushed out of the team. There is a risk we see that against Sheffield United, but I'm not sure. Bar the Chelsea game, the Gabriel, Saliba, Zinchenko and Ben White back four has looked as solid as it was last season, and I just think it's the best defence that Arsenal can play. And I still think, regardless of their performance in that Chelsea game, obviously conceding a couple of goals, still one of the best defences in the league. One of the goals came from Raya, didn't it? So you've got to consider that as well. I mean, it was basically a cross from Mudryk that ended up in the goal that Arsenal could have defended, I think, if Raya was in a good position in his goal. He had the highest expected goals amongst all defenders in the Premier League last season. That's not quite come to fruition this season. I mean, you can see the stats there. He's had barely a sniff. He did have a good chance, though, from a corner. I can't remember if it was a corner or a cross against Chelsea. Remind me in the comments. But he did have a good opportunity against Chelsea to score. So, yeah, I really like him as an option at 4.7 million. And to be honest, if there's a couple of games he doesn't start for that reason I mentioned, 4.7 million, I mean, you can just stick him on your bench. That's kind of the end of the video. I've, of course, missed players to avoid. But based on what we've seen so far this week, you can let me know in the comments if there are any. Potentially, David Raya could be one, but I've got a feeling that Arteta keeps the faith in him and he gets over those mistakes and still remains a really decent option. I think it's just one game, basically. And he could obviously get dropped. He's potentially one, I guess, you could ignore. But yeah, let me know in the comments if there are any more. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave me a like rating. Subscribe to the Goal and Goal channel, which should be just here. I'll be back again in a couple of days with some more FPL content. So stick around for my next video.